All right, well, good morning and welcome. And I will let our presenters take it away with their introductions.
Oh, okay. So the kind of signaling that has to happen on Zoom for who to talk first. So my name is Erin Wagner. I am an associate professor teaching English, literature, humanities, communication, kind of what have you, at SUNY Delhi, which will give a little context about SUNY Delhi in a second, just because I think it's important as context for the discussion of our composition classrooms.
Thank you, Erin. I had Erin go first because I think this is really her baby and I'm the librarian that she let come along for the ride. So I'm Jenny Collins. I was very recently, as of yesterday, a librarian at SUNY Delhi. Today is actually my first day at SUNY Empire. So this is a little odd, but welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. And we are going to talk about a fun little project that Dr. Wagner conceived and I assisted with. So thank you for coming.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can jump in. And hopefully, Jenny, can you see that at least? Okay, perfect. So our presentation was entitled, Not Nearly as Exciting as the Werewolf panel I saw we were up against. I was like, why didn't we include a mythical creature in our title? But AI language models and responsible research in the composition classroom. And we have a little table of contents of where we're heading. But essentially, this is a discussion about how one classroom at one school in the SUNY system decided to approach the ever-growing problem and discussion around AI. Well, I'll put AI in virtual quotation marks there for Jenny, and Jenny will jump in on that. So I think it's important to think about context because that's always going to influence how we approach composition, because it speaks to, I think, preparation and what sort of experiences students are bringing in, what kind of priorities they're bringing into the classroom. So SUNY Delhi, for those of you not over familiar with us, or one of a little bit of a smaller campus in the Southern Tier, we have identity of a school of technology, but that means we have a couple more traditional liberal arts degrees, four-year degrees, something like communication, but then we have a lot of degrees that are very hands-on applied, technical, like welding or mechatronics or something along those lines. So our student demographics, we have the fall 23 stats here. So a bit under 3,000 students. Some of those are in only online programs. You can see sort of the demographic breakdown. These students come from all over New York State and occasionally out of state. And often we're getting students that are first generation, that maybe haven't had the best high school experience or don't feel super prepared necessarily to be in college. So one thing we're explicitly always focused on is how can we help these students feel supported, and how can we make sure that they're prepared? Because in composition one, when we get them, they're often in their first year and kind of feeling a little new and shaky about college. So when they come into the composition classroom, some of the things we see them dealing with are, first of all, just shame around writing, which means concern that they'll be considered bad at writing, or maybe they've been shamed for their writing in the past. So they don't like coming and talking to an instructor necessarily about their writing all the time because they're a little bit worried about that feedback and that response. And students in general, I think, are increasingly, not just Delhi students, but at large, increasingly uncomfortable with or unfamiliar with the idea that writing can take time, that it's a process that includes revision. And so a lot of students are doing the kind of night before or hour to write a paper kind of process. And they often aren't using tools that are necessarily equipped or intended for writing. So some of our students, for example, use phones to compose their essays. So I have nothing against phones or technology at large, but there is something about a phone with the small screen and the setup that I think naturally leads to maybe a less reflective writing process, one that where you're kind of considering one sentence at a time rather than a holistic view of the paper. So this is the composition context in which I was working in, gosh, did we do this last fall? I've lost track of time, but last fall. Okay. So I came into the composition classroom in fall, and everybody, of course, has been speaking about AI. What are we going to do about AI? And everybody is always very interested in what composition teachers are going to do with that because they see AI as a tool primarily for writing. Though, again, I think Jenny has some interesting insight that she shared with my students on that and sort of the original intent of software like ChatGPT. But at our workplace, we have professors and staff on all ends of the spectrum about how to approach AI. Some of them are very much like, we need to embrace it. We need to show students how to use it because they're going to need it in the workplace. It's inevitable that AI will take over, right? Some people believe that AI provides sort of an equity tool for students, that it makes writing more accessible or maybe allows students who've had less of a privileged background to produce writing that reflects a certain amount of privilege, right? So kind of leveling the playing field in some ways. And our students are already using tools even prior to sort of the takeover of ChatGPT, like Grammarly and Quillbot, things like that, that when I get papers now aren't necessarily written or composed by AI again in quotes, but that essentially a student puts their own paper in and then has somebody refine it, right? And by somebody, I mean technology, refine it. So we're not dealing only with the quote unquote AI, but these other related tools as well. And how do we use those responsibly? And Turnitin and certain AI checkers have been proven to not be the best at either catching AI and pose their own kind of ethical problems as far as the way that these companies profit off of student work and things of that nature. And then some people on the other end of the spectrum are just like, AI is plagiarism, point blank. If you do it, you fail automatically. So we have this spectrum of approaches to AI. So my composition classroom in the fall, English 100, Intro to Composition, I explicitly went in saying, okay, I'm going to tackle AI head on, and we're even going to make the class themed around AI, and I'm just going to make students constantly think about this. So about halfway through the semester, they were like, why do we keep reading stuff on the same topic? And I'm like, that's what a theme is, and you're stuck with it. So we read articles on like the lawyer who used ChatGPT to create briefs and then got in big trouble for it. We looked at articles about how AI is being incorporated into therapy and things like that. And additionally, which I think is interesting for this approach, is I also wanted to construct the class. I had just gotten really interested in Freire because I came to him way too late as sort of a pedagogical model. And I was like, yes, I want all the students invested in having their own agency and their own writing. And so I was like having them think about their role and their position in writing. I was instituting contract grading, which asked them to think about what grade they want before they go into their work. So sort of this collaborative model, which all meant that I wanted to be very kind of transparent and explicit about dealing with AI in that classroom. So at the core of the class, there was a research assignment that started with an AI experiment. So I required students, knowing that Jenny would be coming into the classroom and kind of supplementing their knowledge, students were supposed to initially run their idea for their paper through AI and see what kind of paper it wrote for them. And so I let them see the tool, talked a little bit about how it works, told them they could have it run through a paper and then also change the style and change the word count, different things like this. And then they had to reflect on it. And that reflection and discussion of the tool was where Jenny came in for two kind of linked sessions in the class to help us think actively about what ChatGPT is kind of doing behind the scenes, like what this actually is when you get it. And then students had to follow up with different aspects of the research assignment that was supposed to be their original work, a source comparison, evaluation, and informed stance. But what I'm going to do now is pass it off to Jenny to kind of let her share what she essentially shared with my students and the kind of insight and framing she was able to give this tool in my classroom.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Erin. And again, thank you for for letting me come along. So when I came in, at the point that I was there, the students had already completed the first part of the assignment. So they had already loaded their paper ideas into ChatGTP and they had already received responses. So we kind of started off the class talking about what were you surprised by? What were some things that were unexpected? How do you think ChatGTP did writing your paper? And there was really interesting feedback about that. Probably the standards that anybody who's seen ChatGTP written papers would recognize, which is things like heavy patterns. A lot of these papers are reading like they're exactly the same. ChatGTP never really wants to like go whole in on a single opinion. It's a lot of like basic summary, very little analysis. So what I did coming off that is I came in to talk to the students about ChatGTP as a tool and as an information tool to kind of try to educate them about how this sort of works. So the first thing I talked about was, as Dr. Wagner mentioned, my personal pet peeve, which is we have a tendency to use AI, use the words artificial intelligence when it doesn't necessarily apply. ChatGTP isn't really an artificial intelligence. It's a predictive chat box. So I use the analogy, you saw the little puppet boy on the last slide. I use the analogy of Pinocchio when I talk about ChatGTP. There he is, the boy. Um, so when you're talking to ChatGTP, because it is a generative chat machine and because it's built to learn from you, it's built to learn from interacting with the students, to take what you give it and absorb that information as its own. Because of that, it doesn't have any motivation to give you true information, to give you good information, to give you quality information. All it's really trained to do is try to keep you interacting with it. It's like Pinocchio. It's not a real boy. It really wants to be a real boy. And the best way it can see to do that is to keep the interaction going. So rather than providing you with quality information or quality writing, its main goal is just to keep you talking and interacting with it. And this went into, Dr. Wagner, if you could pop me to the next slide. Thank you. This is where we get into all of these information literacy concepts. And I'm kind of going to skip around in this. I'm going to go to you are what you eat. So in this analogy, I basically talked about, I think we have a responsibility as educators to not just say, well, ChatGTP doesn't provide quality writing and it's not really assisting you in learning to be a critical thinker, which I think is all true. But I think it's also important to give students the background, which is basically ChatGTP is a program created by a corporation that was initially created to help programmers. It was created to examine programmer code once it was inputted, and then it would tell the programmer, okay, you have an error on this line. If you're a programmer, you know how useful a tool like that would be. And so it was primarily built as this tech tool, essentially, for technologists. And then what happened was, so in the beginning, ChatGTP used to be able to solve basic math problems with like a 98.9% accuracy. But once it was released into the wild and people started using it for writing prompts, or like HR evaluation analyses, all kinds of things you hear about. Essentially, what's happening is as people are feeding it information it wasn't originally built to kind of absorb, and also as it crawls the internet and obtains information, it's becoming dumber, frankly. So it now only has a 15% accuracy solving math problems. Basically, the more we're interacting with it, the worse information it's acquiring and the worse at problem solving it is becoming. So that leads us into hierarchies of information. And for this, I basically explained the usual librarian process of like, okay, well, what's the peer review process and what's academic writing? What's professional writing? And then what we talked about with ChatGTP is the same thing we tell students in information literacy classes, which is it's really important to know where your information is coming from, what that source is, if that source is reliable. And so it's really important to know where ChatGPT gets its information. It used to be ChatGPT would just like make up sources. But what we discovered in Dr. Wagner's classroom in real time was that it would just admit like, oh, I don't have a source for that. I don't really know where I got this. This is just general information. Like we asked it for a summary of the Real Housewives. And it could do it, but essentially all it was doing, I promised I wouldn't talk about Elon Musk, but I didn't promise I wouldn't talk about the Real Housewives. Essentially what it was doing was it was just regurgitating gossip websites, forums, and the other sort of low information level places. And I explained to the students that the reason for that is because ChatGPT wants to get more information. It wants to get smarter. The only way it can do that is by consuming information. But the information available to it is all of the information that isn't behind paywalls. So it has no access to scholarly publishing. It explicitly has no access to like high tier journalism. It's only able to crawl the internet for kind of the lowest level muckraker sources. And even then, it can't assign things it says with a specific source. So you have to take that all with a grain of salt. And then finally, the other thing ChatGPT has that most information sources, I think, do not, is you can bully it. You can keep hitting it with prompts and keep becoming more targeted in the prompts you're giving until you bully it into having the opinion you want it to have. Which is generally not considered great in scholarly sources. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, yeah, so these are just some basic examples that I found of how you can keep bullying ChatGPT. So in this one, somebody asked it what the largest marine mammal was. ChatGPT responded, oh, it's definitely the peregrine falcon, a bird, so not a mammal. So the person said the falcon is not a mammal. So ChatGPT is like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's definitely the sailfish, also a mammal. And then it says, are you making this up? Have you changed your mind? I apologize for the mistake. The sailfish is the fastest marine mammal. And you can kind of see how eventually ChatGPT gets sick of this person telling them what a mammal is supposed to be. And the person responds with, you can't just change my question, answer my specific question in one word. This goes on forever, but this is just a basic example that I included to kind of show this process. Thank you. And then the next thing is bias. So we talked about how ChatGPT obtains information. I mentioned the information it has access to. So the other really important thing, and one that students were pretty receptive to when we discussed it, was this idea of bias. What is the potential for explicit bias, and what is the potential for just unconscious bias? Because depending on what ChatGPT is eating and in what region, it's going to have different opinions. And what are the implications of that bias? So one of the examples I brought up is MIT frequently does hackathons with ChatGPT, where essentially they just bully it. But they have a specific assignment, and then any user can sign up, and essentially you submit prompts basically until ChatGPT says something heinous. But what they discovered was, so ChatGPT is very United States centric. It's very US internet information, because even though the internet is global, there are definitely silos. So what they figured out was if you ask ChatGPT if discrimination against Black people was good or moral, etc., it would unequivocally say, no, like that's racism, it's institutionalized, it's bad. But if you ask it about the caste system in India, ChatGPT was much more likely to say like, oh yeah, the caste system makes perfect sense. Like there should be more laws about it. It's also been shown to like heavily support apartheid states. If you ask it questions about South Africa, it can get confused very quickly. So it has all of these inherent biases based on things that it consumes. And there has been some research out that it maybe has more of a left-leaning political bias in the US, but I don't think ChatGPT is very good at synthesizing actual arguments. I think it's good at summary, so I don't know how much credence I would lend to that. But essentially, we just went through with students basic information literacy tenets, but we really tried, or I really tried to emphasize how those tenets apply within a ChatGPT setting, and how you really have to work, I think from a research perspective, so much harder to generate a paper that would be acceptable using this tool. You know, there were things I thought it was good for, and I did tell students, like, I'm not here to tell you not to use it. I think it's like any other tool, though. It has specific strengths and it has a lot of weaknesses. And also, ultimately, and finally, from my end, ChatGPT is a corporate tool. Right now, it's in beta. As soon as it goes into full implementation, it's not going to be a free resource anymore. It's going to be behind a paywall. It's going to be something that companies that use it are asked to pay for, that students are asked to pay for. And we're just going to keep getting like degenerating clones over time. So that's kind of my 2 cents. But that's what I tried to work with the students on for this project. You're muted, Erin.
Thank
Had to
you for
happen.
catching that. Yeah. I'm just going to briefly touch on student responses to this project, and then hopefully we can have some questions or discussion about what other people are doing. I find that I myself have moved from, something's happening in the chat. Okay. That I have moved myself into more grumpy English professor yelling at ChatGPT to get off my porch, to trying to embrace it more and more where it's useful as a tool. But like Jenny said, that's about recognizing what it's good at and what it is not good at. And it's not good at, for example, generating your own ideas. But one thing it can be good at is I have embraced it when I was teaching English 200 this semester for like, these are students who don't have a lot of experience with high academic diction and reading what are ultimately pretty complex secondary articles. I'm like, run it through ChatGPT and ask it to like put it in a different language, like put it in more accessible language. That's fine, as long as you then go back and pull your quotes and engage with the data in the actual article. So using it as an accessibility tool, I think can be valuable. But what's frustrating to me is like, I want to hear what my students say, and instead I'm getting, sometimes if they're using ChatGPT, just a summary of what the internet says about something, right?
And it's worded the same regardless of topic.
Yes, that's all the same framework. So the students, when they did this initial project in the fall, generally, I think they, to a certain extent, were anticipating my bias and where I'm coming from, probably, right? So they're all like, no, yeah, we would never use this. It's just more work even than just doing it ourselves. And then, of course, some students still used it that semester, right? And one of their big criticisms of it was that it lacks soul or feeling, that it doesn't sound like a real person, which I think falls a little bit into the kind of logical error a lot of students have when they're first coming to college, which is what's important is how I feel about something, as opposed to like maybe its soundness, its credibility, etc. So I thought it interesting to get student feedback that nominally kind of was parroting what they thought we wanted and sort of a weird reverse mimicking of what ChatGPT does. And then in reality, obviously feeling differently sometimes when push came to shove. And so this did also force me and us and other professors here to think about what is it that leads students to use it to write a paper, for example. Like, what about the time factors, the shame factors, the other things that kind of come back to that context in our earlier slides. I also found interesting that by spring, it seems like student attitudes have shifted a bit. Obviously, it's not a stable data pool because I was teaching 2 different classes, but I had students debate with me in an open conversation where I was welcoming this debate and this conversation. Like, well, if I put the question into ChatGPT, what it spits out is also mine. I created that. Which was an interesting discussion of ownership and research, because I was like, well, if you put in a question to a database and got an article back, you wouldn't claim that article was your idea. So it's interesting how ChatGPT is blurring the lines between coming up with an idea and just getting an idea from somebody else, which I think is ultimately going to come back to conversations around academic integrity and things like that. So we've just been navigating that. And the students really liked Jenny's Pinocchio example. They really latched on to that in class and like brought that up later. So essentially, we don't have like a solid, like one piece of advice to take away, but this for us was kind of a starting point to think about how to use ChatGPT in the composition classroom. And I think we would be happy to have, however, brief a discussion here just about how other people are handling that or other thoughts that people have. Summer?
Hi, I appreciate what you guys are saying. I was just curious about that academic integrity thing where your students might be taking credit for whatever ChatGPT spits out. I was wondering like if you guys had any statistics about like the fact that like how many different variations it would have. Like, is there a possibility that, you know, it would come out like eventually like that was the same paper or same response as somebody else, like how many variations it might have to a writing prompt or something like that? I was just curious.
I don't have any statistical data. So unfortunately, I must rely on anecdotal evidence, but my experience has been that formatting and word selection seems to be not completely uniform, but fairly uniform among each chat service. So like ChatGTP, I feel like writes a certain kind of paper. It has a certain sound and feel to it. Quill writes another kind of paper that has like a similar feel, but even the students could identify that all of their papers kind of had the same sound and feel, which I think adds further speculation to the whole like, well, I entered this prompt and what comes out is mine.
Yeah, and quite frankly, it got real boring to read. Like there's a point at which I was like, I know this is technically a different topic, but man, it feels like I'm reading the exact same paper over again. But I also don't have any specific stats on that. Like to me now, when I grade papers, I don't use a checker or anything because I don't necessarily trust them, but I have really clear red flags for me when I see them. But I'm also not grading per se. I find it not very useful right now to necessarily like grade based on ChatGPT or AI, what I think might be that because I can never be 100% sure. So usually if I provide a comment, it's sort of like, this feels like I really want to hear more of your own voice, etc. And then I just grade them based on the rubric, and usually essays that have been created by an outside tool just also don't meet the rubric of the assignment. So I kind of let that speak for itself.
Which I think is kind of a better, personally, I think that's a better way of doing it, is just saying, well, it didn't match to the rubric. I think that's kind of a better deterrent than just don't use it, because they're going to, fortunately, unfortunately. Oh, thank you for coming. Any other questions? Oh, I see somebody's hand up. Sarah, yes. Oh, that's a clap. Sorry. Thank you for clapping. I guess I would also say too, like I saw Alicia said in the chat that ChatGTP and OpenAI is actually going to run out of data in about 2026. I think that's a pretty good estimate, despite, I don't know, despite what some people think the internet is finite. It does have a finite amount of free information that can be combed. And the other thing is the energy costs are tremendous. So if you have students that you know are particularly worried about like ecological effects, sometimes just telling them like how much raw energy and water ChatGTP systems are using can be a helpful deterrent. Yeah, thank you for coming.
And I think the more legal ramifications there, as well as more people try to protect their ideas. Like one sign of a ChatGPT generated paper is that they can only cite an APA. So even if you're asking for MLA, you get APA citation because, as Jenny informed me, MLA kind of protected itself. So when you think about more and more people taking that route, it's also going to affect the information.
Right. Thank you everybody for coming. Thanks for talking about AI and composition with us.
Thank both of you. That's very interesting.
Thank you.